Welcome back to another episode of No Bolts Left Behind. Today, I've got a big project. I need to make a big upgrade to my 6-cylinder Mustang to make sure it can handle the torque of the new, recently swapped 5.0 liter V8. I've already got the V8 in the car, so let me bring you up to speed on the project. I bought a running, driving 1996 Ford Explorer V8 and cut it up, tore it apart, so I could take out the entire powertrain and swap it into my 68 Mustang. I have the engine, transmission, and wiring harness already installed. And today I'm installing the last big Ford Explorer piece into the Mustang, the rear axle. All right, so here's the legendary 8.8 Ford rear axle. And these are the two big reasons why this is the axle of choice for my Mustang swap. Right there. 3L73 means 373 gears, which is a good little gear set for lots and lots of tire smoke. And the L means limited slip. So this is a Posi unit. It's got a pretty sweet gear set from the factory. That means no one tire fire for me. I'm going to be spinning both wheels on a burnout. And both wheels are going to lock up when I accelerate too. So that's a very, very good thing and a very expensive thing to set up, I've learned, if you're trying to upgrade your non-Posi axle. You've got the carriers are very expensive, gear sets can be a little bit expensive, and setting this thing up with a good shop is actually very, very expensive, that I've learned many times over the hard way. So I'm happy to have everything just already set up for me, OEM, and this thing should almost drop into the Mustang. Oh, and one little added bonus with this guy, just as like a little cherry on top of the already awesome setup, are factory disc brakes in the rear, which is also kind of an expensive setup if you're trying to upgrade your drum brakes. So the question is, why am I upgrading the axle at all? It's a pretty easy question to answer. This thing from the factory is a really tiny little rear axle. So it's safe to say that this thing would probably self-destruct very, very quickly after doing my first good hard launch with that 5.0. And here's another problem. 4-lug axle as opposed to the normal 5-lug, which I suppose has a little bit more strength and has a lot better wheel options. So that's another big selling point for this guy. Not to mention, I've already done a disc brake upgrade in the front, which already has converted me over to 5-lug setup up here. So it wasn't really ideal to have like a mismatched setup. So after this is done, we'll have the same bolt pattern front and back, and I can carry around one spare tire. All right, so this thing is sitting pretty much as I pulled it out of the Explorer. I haven't popped the cork yet on this rear diff cover, so hopefully everything looks good in there, but it seemed just fine in the Explorer. So the first step is to pop open this guy and drain out all the fluid. All right, it's looking pretty good in there, I guess. Not 100% sure what to look for, but let's take a look at this fluid. Yeah, I guess that's probably what I'd expect a 160,000 mile diff to look like. A little bit of a dark, whatever. I don't know if that's metal shaving or whatever, but yeah, it's I'll call that passable. I'm definitely gonna send it one way or the other. Cool, well, as long as there's no like obvious shiny metal chunks, I think we're probably good. All right, these brake rotors are pretty rusty and kind of stuck. So let me pull off these calipers here and we'll spin this guy around and see what it looks like. All right, there we go. I went ahead and just pulled off the entire brake setup actually, from side to side with the hoses and stuff. And I'm probably just gonna leave it just like that because these things can get really stuck and I really don't wanna have to buy a new brake line. So we'll just let that one sit. And now this thing is spinning freely. And as you can see, one way to test if it's Posi or if your Posi is working is when you spin one wheel, if the other one on its own, like off the ground, spins the same way, you do have a Posi. So as you can see, that guy is rotating the same way. Awesome. So this Posi is good. And I suppose it's got some wear on it as you'd expect, but I think this thing is going to do just fine in the Mustang. So good to see. I'm really happy that the Posi works. And by the way, I do know that Posi is a Chevy term, and if this is a Ford, it's called something else, like maybe like limited slip or something. But you know what? Posi is the word that we all use, so I'm just going to call it Posi because I guess it's a lot funner to say than limited slip or sure grip or whatever the Mopar equivalent is. So Posi. Here we go. All right, next step is to kind of strip this axle down. It's got a bunch of like little brackets and things on this guy. And all I'm gonna need are spring perches for the Mustang. And unfortunately, these are not the right width. Oh, you know, let's measure it before I cut them off. But as far as I know, these are not the right width. That's from inside to inside here. Whoa. We're looking at something like 37, maybe 36. All right, there you go. Something like 39 or 40. Definitely not 37. So in case you were wondering, these spring perches will not work for the 68 Mustang. However, I got myself a set of brand new spring perches right here. Some pretty hefty boys. So I will have to cut those guys off and re-weld these guys very, very carefully with some very precise alignment. And we also got some tabs for what were kind of like, I guess, traction bars. Kind of a cool feature on the Explorer, but I just don't think there's going to be any way to adapt it. I actually kept them. I think that's one right there. And I was like thinking maybe I would try and adapt this guy, but I just don't think that's really going to be possible. And we also got some sway bar mounts, which is that guy right there I pulled off. Kind of the same thing. I considered maybe trying to keep this guy sway bar, but all of my research says that sway bars don't really do much on a 68 Mustang. I'm not sure why that might be. I feel like there could be some benefit. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut those guys off. I can always add like an aftermarket sway bar later, just like I did with my Challenger. So, all right, time for a lot of dusty grinding. All right, I got some of this stuff stripped off a little bit. I wanted to kind of clean it up before I start grinding. I got the rotors off because I'm definitely going to replace those guys. They're pretty old and we're very, very seized on this axle here, but a little bit of heat got those guys off. Okay, I think now I'm ready to start grinding. Ooh, this is going to be very, very dusty. One down, 5 to go. Whew, all right, 4 down and 2 to go. Definitely the grinder is, like the big angle grinder is the way to go on this guy, but I've toasted out 2 discs so far, so definitely have spare ones. I did cut a little bit into the axle tube right here. It's kind of a bummer, but not a big deal. I can just hit it with a bead of weld and grind it back down later. All right, I got this thing totally ground down. Actually looking pretty good. This flap disc here was definitely a godsend. And got my gouges all welded and ground flat, so everything's good. Whew. So I guess the very last thing I want to do here is locate where the axle perches are going to be more or less, and then grind down that area to get a good weld when the time comes. So I think I measured it somewhere around like 39 inches apart. So I'll grind out like a good area, you know, around it down to bare metal just so I can have a little bit of wiggle room. And then I think that's just about it. All right, I got this thing lifted up and I got it on jack stands. So the rear axle is kind of hanging on the leaf springs here. And I got PB Blaster on all of these like super rusty bolts. So the first step is to pull off these guys right here. And the plan is to drop the leaf springs down like this so that I can, and I'll keep the axle on wheels so that I can hopefully just roll this guy right on out on its own wheels. All right, got this guy out of here. Only had to hit a couple of bolts with heat, but here's why I'm upgrading this guy. Because look at this cute little adorable differential. I don't think I've ever seen a smaller differential on any, you know, medium-sized, bigger car. So in comparison, here's the new guy, which let's get like a quick. There's definitely no comparison in size here. I mean, this guy is like way bigger. So definitely holds a lot more power. You know, one big reason why I'm choosing this Ford Explorer axle to swap into this guy is because just so happens to be, let's see here, backing plate to backing plate is something like 54.5. There's going to be a little bit of difference here because the axle space or whatever. Very, very close. Supposedly this axle is maybe just like 1/4 of an inch wider, or maybe half an inch, I can't remember, but less than an inch wider. So it's almost, like, very coincidentally, almost exactly the same width as the 67, 68, maybe later Mustangs. And even on the earlier Mustangs, like the 64, 65, whatever, supposedly this thing actually fits okay too. Now, one thing that's kind of a little bit of a, I don't want to say an issue, but definitely something to note is that this center section is actually quite a bit offset. So you can measure it here. I'll go from the outside edge to the middle, something like 26.5. And then from this side, outside to the middle is 30.5. So that makes it, if I'm not mistaken, 2 inches offset, because it subtracts 2 inches and adds 2 inches. So I think a common thing to do is to actually cut this side of the axle tube to match the length of this guy. So you end up with a centered axle more or less, and then just grab an extra axle from this side and throw it in there, so you're not having to like build custom axle lengths. I'm choosing not to do that. That would actually make this guy quite a bit more narrow, but I'd rather keep the same stock track width. That's going to make the drive shaft have to deviate a little bit from center line, but it should be okay. I'll explain when I'm setting up my drive shaft angles, my logic as to how an offset axle is not going to cause a problem, or I hope it's not going to cause a problem. But anyway, let's get this guy installed in there. I'm going to roll it under, I'm going to set it on those leaf spring perches, and then set those on the leaf springs. And then I can throw a couple of tacks and pull it back out. So I got the axle resting on the leaf springs. I got the leaf springs bolted up here and kind of hanging in there. I think we're good there. So one very important thing I gotta do is make sure that it's aligned left to right. So I suppose the distance between the backing plate here and the leaf spring should be exactly the same on both sides. I'm definitely not trying to center this because this is not centered. So maybe before tack welding, I'll double check from a couple different points here. But and of course the other measurement that's super important is the axle angle here. And I think my strategy for that is going to be to actually bolt some wheels on this thing. I do have these Challenger drag radials kind of hanging out here. They're gonna look a little goofy, definitely a little big on this thing, and I'm hoping they don't rub on the fender here, because these are 255s, but actually it kind of seems like somebody's already rolled this fender. That's interesting. Okay, well that gives me a little bit of extra room. I wonder why somebody did that with a 6-cylinder. So I think first I'll dial in the left to right as close as I can. Then I'll throw these wheels on there and set it down on its weight, and we'll get this thing sitting level, and then we'll dial in the pinion angle. All right, got these Challenger wheels on here, and I'm very surprised that actually these 255s really do fit in these wheel wells. There you go. If you're wondering if 255s fit under a Mustang, It looks a little crazy, definitely like muscly, but they do seem to fit, so cool. I'm glad that these will be good rollers until I get my wheels and tires ordered. And I was waiting to get the axle in here to order them so I can measure like offset and all of that, so that's very helpful. So next step is to level this thing out. I don't know why this thing has such a crazy like upward rake. I have what I think is plenty of weight on the front, but it's still really sitting very high on the front. Maybe I'll air down the front tires just to help out a little bit. And I definitely got to do some adjusting on this thing because it kind of, the jack kind of flipped out and this thing sort of like rolled all the way backwards. I guess hit my, hit my fuel pump mount right there. That was a little wild. So I'll have to figure out a way to push that back around. I mean, I guess it should kind of rotate on this, and then we'll do some fine tuning. It seems like just luckily I managed to get this thing center to center. I'm within like a 1/16 of an inch left to right. So I think I actually might just keep it. What's really important is that these rears have the same, tuck on both sides. And I mean, it looks good to me. All right, so the tire deflation really did the trick. So that's good. So all of my kind of random measurements here, it seems like I'm pretty darn close. And if we go down to the pinch weld here, we're at pretty close to half, about the same. So we're at about a 1/2 inch downward slope, which is kind of what I was going for. I think it'll be close enough to set the pinion angle anyway, and we can always fine tune the stance a little bit later on. All right, I think we're in position now to start fine tuning my pinion angle in relation to the engine transmission downward angle. And obviously I'm swapping the engine transmission and swapping the rear axle. So I'll have to be extra careful because nothing is stock here and everything might be a little bit wonky. Either way, we're gonna get this dialed in. So let me go over my sort of thoughts and approach on pinion angles. This is something I spent more time researching, more than probably any other car thing. And actually, probably more than any other thing in my life, pinion angles and, working U-joint angles and all that stuff. And there's some sort of like conflicting information out there. So I'll tell you my thoughts. I'm also going to talk about the offset rear axle. All right, so you've got your engine. I'm definitely not an artist, so bear with me here. All right, engine, transmission, forget about the wheels. Okay, okay. Engine, transmission, differential, and drive shaft in between. And the basic idea here is whatever angle your engine and transmission are sitting at, so if this is pretty much flat, you're gonna wanna match that angle at your differential, pretty much flat. So if your engine's actually sitting at an angle like this, you're gonna wanna match the differential angle, something like this. Your drive shaft is gonna be in between. That's gonna keep your U-joints from binding up. As long as these two angles are parallel to each other, it doesn't matter if the engine's angling up or angling down, you just kind of want to match it at the differential. However, there's one thing to note about leaf spring cars, which a lot of cars are, and the Mustang certainly is that when power is applied to the differential, you're actually going to get some axle deflection, meaning that this thing's going to want to twist up. So this angle's going to change pretty drastically, actually. It definitely depends on your horsepower, because a more powerful car is going to kind of twist this thing a little bit harder and it's going to deflect up. I actually have a video of this that shows it really well in my Challenger. Now obviously my Challenger is a little on the higher side of horsepower, but I actually checked out my Nissan Xterra as well, which is definitely on the low end for a street car. And you can see actually still quite a bit of axle deflection on that guy. So that means for a leaf spring car, in my experience, in my opinion, you don't actually want to keep these the same. So if this is a 2-degree downward angle here, a lot of people will tell you to put a 2-degree downward angle here, and that's You know, that might be pretty close for like a 4-link or a non-leaf spring car, but for a leaf spring car, you're actually going to want to angle it down a little bit to offset that flip up when you're on the gas. The question is how much to offset, and that really depends on your engine and transmission. When you're running something with a little less power like me, maybe around 2 degrees is okay. One thing to keep in mind is that when you let off on the gas, the opposite actually happens. So this thing will actually deflect back down, and I feel like you don't want to deviate too much from this center line here. Of course, there's one other thing that I'm dealing with this axle, and that's the offset differential. So instead of a side view, we're going to do a top-down view here. So the engine looks something like this. The transmission comes down. There's the output shaft, and then the differential. Here's a wheel. There's another wheel. Oh, that's not a wheel. There we go. And the axle tube is something like this. Okay, maybe not as drastic. Maybe not as drastic as that, but it is offset. So if this is the center of the car here, the wheels are centered, but this thing is not in the center like the engine and transmission are. All right, pretend like I did that in the center of the, there we go. This thing is offset a little bit, a couple inches from the center line. And I don't think this is going to be a problem. So the same theory applies here, where if the line of the engine from a top view is like this, and the line from the axle is offset like this, these are two parallel equal angles. So you shouldn't be putting any extra stress on the drive shaft here, as long as this angle isn't too extreme. So obviously there's a limit as to how far offset it can be. So as long as this angle here is like within 2 or 3 degrees, I think I'll be okay, and I don't think it'll be an issue at all. All right, so first step we got to figure out is what sort of angle the engine and transmission is sitting at. And hopefully that should be pretty easy to find here. I assume that this intake manifold, whatever the top of this plenum, is pretty close to the flat, engine plane. And it looks to me like it's 2 degrees downward, which is actually really perfect. I think that's very, very common for engines to be from the factory. So that's awesome. This is actually the most difficult and important thing to get right. You do want it more or less flat, maybe with a little bit of a downward angle. Oftentimes, transmission tunnels and things like that will get in the way, but it looks like we hit that right on the mark. I'll measure a couple other points. Let's try and get a reading at the tail shaft. Should be pretty close. Going off the tail shaft rubber isn't ideal, but got about 2.2 there. Okay. So if we're sitting at a 2.2 downward angle, that means that in a perfect world with no axle deflection, we would want to go up, or actually still what's called down, but it would be actually raising the pinion up to match that 2.2 downward angle. But in our case, to compensate for that axle flip up that's going to happen to this guy under even moderate acceleration, we're going to put it just about flat. I think 0 degrees is actually a pretty safe spot to be. All right, I got that thing sitting right at almost 0. Gotta say, I was really hoping for that perfect like 0.0, Project Binky moment there, but 0.2 is close enough for me. So I guess I'm gonna do a couple of checks left to right just to make sure that we're, as close as I can get, as I can sort of eyeball this left to right axle, and then we'll be ready to weld. Probably just throw a couple tacks on each side and pull this axle back out of here, and we'll fully weld it up after. All right, I got a couple of tacks on there. I hope they hold. I guess the game now is to very delicately unbolt and pull this guy out of here without breaking those tacks. I think it should be okay. All right, I got this thing out of here and I'm ready to weld. But I was glancing at this thing, and one thing I noticed that is a little weird is that there's just a tiny bit of toe in here. These things each have a little bit of angle towards the inside. This one a little bit more, actually. I was gonna cut off my welds and try and, move them a little bit, but then I noticed the old marks on the springs here are the opposite. It seems like they're toed out, and I'm assuming that those are straight. Same with this guy. This guy has a little bit of a toe out. My guess is that the springs in the Mustang here kind of bend in a little bit like that and bend in like this. While I was making these perfectly square on the spring, I actually ended up with a slight turn. I don't think it's going to matter too much, and these just kind of rest on top of the spring anyway, so if anything, I'm going to get maybe even a little bit more surface contact with the slightly toed in customized spring perches. So instead of breaking these welds and risking or actually probably pretty much guaranteeing messing up my pinion angle, I think I'm just going to weld them like this, and I think it'll be okay. So I guess we'll find out. All right, so got these set and I'm about to start welding, but I am very, very terrified of axle warpage because, of course, when you weld something, it gets very hot, and hot metal likes to warp when it cools down. So I want to be very, very careful when I weld these guys, and I'm just gonna do maybe like an inch at a time and flip sides, letting the other side cool down. So wish me luck. I really hope this thing doesn't warp. All right, let's give it a try. All right, got it all welded, and it doesn't seem warped. The welds didn't come out super pretty because I kept having to like interrupt my flow there, but I think they're strong enough. Everything looks good. No axle run out that I can see, so I'll let this thing cool down slowly and hit it with some paint. All right, I got this thing all bolted back in here and it's looking pretty good. Everything lined up perfectly. Although I think I do want to just go ahead and knock out these shock mounts. So I'm gonna pull these guys off one by one, and we'll mount up a little piece to mount the OEM shocks onto. All right, so I got here my Explorer spring perch, and here is the factory Mustang spring perch. I think what I'll probably do here is carve out just a little bit of this, something like that, I think. And I'll probably end up drilling the hole right there and then welding just a little piece on right there. All right, there we go. That looks pretty awesome, actually. I'm pretty proud of that. All right, whew. Tired. Went ahead and gave the leaf springs and the shocks the old Craigslist rebuild there. A little rattle can paint. Looking good.